Hello, class. This is to continue with our discussion on defenses. You mentioned there's a number of defenses that can be had when one is accused of a crime, and we've hinted at a couple of these things about self-defense. If you're being provoked, one can say that they were acting in self-defense. But some other things that are considered to be defensible for one's actions and one's age. If you look at what somebody's age is, if they're a juvenile versus an adult, your age can actually, if you're a juvenile, can mitigate. So there's two different elements when a sentencing is made, and that can come into play. One is whether or not there's mitigating circumstances versus aggravating circumstances. Mitigating circumstances are your age. Your age can definitely bring down your criminal culpability, your mental state, whether or not you've been underneath the influences of drugs, not acting in your normal state. That can actually mitigate what your responsibility is for your behavior. Actually, age can work in your favor if you're really old as well, and not having the knowledge for current laws because you are so old that you've lost touch. I've actually read of examples of that. But you're still responsible, but it mitigates your responsibility. It reduces your responsibility. Aggravating are things like, if you commit murder and you've killed, out of who you've killed is potentially a police officer, that is aggravating. That could give you a harsher sentence as a result. Killing a woman that's pregnant, that's aggravating. It makes it harsher and the consequences harsher. So defenses are things that are, there's a wide, it'd be an endless slideshow if we try to cover all the defenses. Insanity is one that evokes a lot of misunderstanding. And so I want to talk about that a little bit more. Most people think it's a very prevalent defense, but it's not at all. Only 1% of all cases, that is only 20% of that 1% of all insanity pleas are argued successfully. So 1% of all cases, and only 20% of that 1% are actually used successfully. And so, yeah, that's a very small fraction. And 90% employ the defense had been previously diagnosed with mental illness. So mental illness is important, but it's not what is going to establish insanity. Insanity can be established by, there's 4 different standards: the M'Naghten rule, the irresistible rule, the Durham rule, and the substantial capacity test. The Durham rule is only used in one state. We won't talk about that as much, but the irresistible rule and the M'Naghten rule and the substantial capacity rule, test is something that we are going to talk about in more detail here. And so here's an example. John suffers from a delusion that Sam is shooting at him, so John shoots Sam. If at the murder trial John claims he was insane and the jury believes him, the question I would have for you is, will they acquit him? Well, okay, so reread that. John suffers from a delusion that Sam is shooting him, so he really believes that he's being shot at by Sam. So he shoots Sam. And yes, this is if John can establish that this delusion was true, that Sam was shooting John, then John did nothing wrong because he was doing what? He was defending himself. So he is not responsible for his action because he was defending himself. So that is, okay, to change that, John is paranoid and that he's paranoid that Sam will kill John the next day. Not now, but the next day. Not imminent threat, but in the future. So John tracks down Sam and kills him. If at the trial John claims he was insane, will the jury acquit him? No, because the jury will probably think about this. They'll think, this is John's delusion was true. Yes, maybe it was true. that John did not act lawfully because John was not under attack in the moment, but was just paranoid that it might happen. He should have gone to the police and reported to the authorities. So he was responsible for the murder. So one's mental illness does not always get one off from a crime. So the M'Naughton rule is the first standard that was established in the 19th century, 1843. This case still is a very high standard for many states. It's used to establish whether or not somebody is responsible or not for their actions. It asks two questions. Did the defendant know what he or she was doing? That's the first question. Secondly, did the defendant know that what he or she was doing was wrong? Did they know that they were doing? Did they know what they were doing? And did they know what they were doing was wrong? So, are they aware of the actions, and are they aware of the legal context of their actions, that it was wrong? That's the two things that it's looked at. The criticism of this is that it's very psychiatrists will say that it's very difficult to believe that somebody is completely not knowing the wrongfulness of their action, and that's something that will be used. Experts, each side of a court case will present their psychiatrist to establish insanity or the absence of insanity, and the prosecution will always bring a psychiatrist and say that it's really difficult to establish that somebody doesn't know what they're doing is wrong. So that's the M'Naughton rule. The irresistible rule was made famous and notorious by Lorena Bobbitt, and this says that there's an inability to stop oneself and one's actions, even if they knew what was wrong about their actions, they could not stop themselves from doing it. Lorena Bobbitt is somebody that case is one that if you are a person living through the 1990s, particularly men, you will be very, very, very cognizant of what was happening with that case. Because Lorena Bobbitt she was a woman being abused and completely mistreated by her boyfriend or husband, and for a long time, and just felt completely in a state of despair and basically took a knife and out of impulse went and cut off the penis of the penis of her boyfriend, and took it and threw it out into a field. Luckily for him, the cops were able to, because she then called the incident into the police and reported what she had done. The police went and retrieved the penis, and he does still have his penis today. Evidently, he has made a living off of, his name is John Bobbitt. He's made a living off of his penis because he has evidently gone into the porn field. A little side note. So this notion, though, that is established by Lorena Bobbitt is something that's important to make note of, because it's something that is still used. The irresistible rule. She was found innocent and she went into, I think, 45 days of treatment and then was released. But the standard that has to be found is that even if you had a policeman at your elbow, you would still not be able to prevent yourself from committing the crime. So the impulse to commit the crime is so strong that even if you had a policeman at your elbow, that you would not be able to do it, would not be able to keep yourself from doing it. So that is the irresistible rule. The substantial capacity test sort of combines both the M'Naughton rule and the irresistible impulse test, because it establishes that you need both those ingredients together. You need to have the absence of awareness of what you're doing is wrong. That's the absence of awareness that what they're doing is wrong, and that one cannot control oneself. And you're so deranged that you cannot, you don't know what is right and what is wrong, and therefore you act unreasonably as well, because you can't control your actions. So those two things for the substantial capacity test needs to be established, and that this is the most prevalent form of insanity defense today. And so, yes, probably the most difficult one to establish. Here's another example. Lorraine has been diagnosed with psychosis and spent most of her life in a mental hospital. While at the mental hospital, Lorraine made friends with many of the patients and healthcare personnel. From time to time, Lorraine would play jokes on those friends. Most of these jokes consisted of putting her antidepressants into their food. Lorraine was always reprimanded and often sternly punished for these escapades. After her release from the mental hospital at the age of 21, Lorraine falls in love with a man by the name of Aiden, a man who works in a bookstore near her apartment. Lorraine decides to make Aiden a love potion. She falls in love with him, decides to make Aiden fall in love with her by feeding him a magic potion, which she concocts out of a mixture of her antidepressants. Lorraine buys a book for Aiden and casually asks if he would like her to buy him coffee. Aiden shrugs and says, "Sure, but I don't have a break for another 2 hours." Lorraine offers to bring him the coffee. Before bringing the drink to Aiden, she puts her magic potion in it. While Aiden is sipping the coffee, Lorraine declares her love for him. She then states, "I know I shouldn't have, but I put a love potion in your coffee. I hope it doesn't hurt you." Aiden becomes sick, seriously ill, and has to go to the hospital after drinking the coffee. So is she responsible for her actions, for his sickness? Is she going to be criminally responsible here? That's the question. According to the substantial capacity test, combining the monotonous and irresistible rule, insanity is present when awareness of wrongdoing is wrong. The question is, was she aware? And her statement of, "I know I shouldn't have, but I put a love potion in your coffee. I hope it doesn't hurt you," indicates that she is not aware of, or she is aware that what she's doing is wrong. That's not a good sign. She's not going to help her cause here. Involuntary compulsion. Lorraine was always reprimanded and often sternly punished for these escapades. So she had done this in the past repetitively, and when she's punished, she still continues to do it, as she is still doing here in the free world. So she gets one half of the standard, but not the full Monty, which, if depends on what state she is, that involuntary compulsion might get her off. But the fact of her awareness of wrongdoing, depending on her state, that the state that she lives in, and the state that the standard that they use, if it's the substantial capacity test, she won't get off. So that is the substantial capacity test at work here, and to show the sort of the complications of it and how it's difficult to establish. The Durham rule is very rarely used. It's used in one state, I think it's New Hampshire, and it is something that it connects mental disease and mental defectness to allow for the establishment of insanity, and it's often used, for mental diseases like actually mental retardation. Not often. When it has been used, it's been used for mental retardation, Down syndrome, and it has to connect directly that the disease caused the crime. The disease caused. There's got to be a direct link between the two, and there's a lot of people who have mental retardation or Down syndrome, or any other sort of mental defect that's typically often genetically induced, and they are completely peaceful, lovely people who don't cause crimes. So it's hard to say that the disease causes a crime when there's so many people who are of that same defect that are not out creating crime. So that's Durham rules, very rarely used. It's talked about in your textbook. It's interesting, but it's not as important to make note of. What is very important to make note of is guilty but mentally ill. Guilty but mentally ill says that you are mentally ill. You have a history of mental illness, but however, you are morally blameworthy for committing the crime that you've committed. Mental illness is a clinical standard insanity is a legal standard, and mental illness does not establish insanity, according to GBMI. So GBMI, guilty but mentally ill, there's some famous cases that have come about, and that is one very notorious one was John DuPont, who killed gold medalist multiple gold medalists, John Schultz. He and his brother were so DuPont, actually John DuPont is of the DuPont family, but he did not follow the family lineage. He had this obsession with wrestling, amateur wrestling, and he kept for many years the training site at his mansion, at Foxcatcher Mansion, the training site for the U.S. Olympics teams. And and he completely hosted and managed and financially supported for many years. The wrestlers knew that he was crazy. He would see Nazis in the trees. He was completely mentally unstable. People knew about it, and people were just said, okay, that's John. But we're also, we're very thankful for his support. And his obsession ended up having him kill David Schultz, tragically killing. There's a movie, fictionalized, a dramatization of his life, and it's very, very factually based, called Foxcatcher, and I highly recommend seeing it. It's interesting. It shows kind of the inside world of what's happening here, and he died in prison. John DuPont did just recently, actually. So what in the world of GBMI? GBMI can act as a mitigating circumstance. It can act as a mitigating. It can reduce one's criminal culpability. Diminish capacity is what it's referred to as. It can diminish your ability to and diminish your responsibility for the crime or for your behavior. And it says that you it's like kind of being like a juvenile. Juveniles, their calculation for their behavior is physically different than an adult, and the consequence for it. So there's a diminished capacity for people who are mentally ill, and it can reduce your criminal culpability. It doesn't exonerate, but it lowers your criminal culpability. Another example would be James Holmes. James Holmes is a famous case from the Aurora Theater shootings in Colorado. Completely insane, completely mentally incompetent to stand trial, and about a year, I think it was, he went off to a mental health hospital because you've got to be mentally competent to understand the charges against you in the court. They cannot put you on trial if you don't understand what's happening in the courtroom. So they sent him off, put him on some drugs, and got him competent, and brought him back into the courtroom. And here, I forget how many people he killed in that incident, but he killed many people in the Aurora Theater shooting, and was found guilty but mentally ill. And that in Colorado is a death penalty state, and they do give out death penalties pretty regularly. So this is not something. This is something that obviously was a little bit of a shocker. So yes, you're welcome to watch the Top Team Foxcatcher on your own time. I was going to show you the preview, but please do check out the movie. Another defense that I want you to be cognizant of and understanding of is a procedural defense. Procedural defense, remember, is process, how you are tried, how you are convicted, can be illegal, can be violating your due process rights, your individual rights. So entrapment makes the claim that the defendant was in some way or another discriminated against in the justice process. If a cop is posing as a drug dealer and offers to sell pot to a passerby and the person agrees, is that entrapment? Well, no. However, If the person refuses and the cop tries to convince him and offers a free sample or discount or any other kind, hey, I've got the best weed here in town, and you got to have this stuff. I'll give you, just keep on pushing and pushing and pushing. And the person agrees eventually just to get rid of the guy or the gal from just get them out of their hair. And then the arrest happens. Is that entrapment? Yes, that can be a standard that can be used to establish entrapment. So entrapment has two different sort of phases of looking at it, the subjective test and the objective test. The subjective test says that what was the state of mind in the defendant's state of mind entering into the context? Did they have a predisposition to commit the crime entering into the scene? Did they go into the scene looking for that pot, or did they had no interest at all, and they just walked right into a criminal situation and they took part in it? The objective test is, did the actions of the government cause a normally law-abiding person to commit a crime? So those two things need to be weighed to establish whether or not entrapment has happened. Did the defendant actually was their intention to commit the crime? Did they have a criminal mindset, in other words? And were the actions, did the actions of the government cross a line into imposing a circumstance that facilitated the criminal action? So that is the difficult standard for entrapment to be established. Jeopardy was mentioned in class earlier today. It is a protection of the Fifth Amendment. It is a common law and constitutional prohibition against second trial for the same offense. There are exceptions. Exceptions are that if you are found innocent in a courtroom of the criminal court, that can, like OJ and Robert Blake both, their criminal case was taken into civil court and they were found responsible. And that's really important to make note of, because in the criminal court, the standard for guilt and responsibility is actually beyond a reasonable doubt. In the civil court, it can be 60% against 40% of the jury to find responsibility. There can be just 1% difference, and that can create your standard for responsibility. So civil court doesn't operate on beyond a reasonable doubt. It operates on a balance of probabilities. You're more likely than not to have been responsible, but not 100%. It's just more likely than not. So in officers in the Rodney King trial, they were found innocent at the state level, but the federal government came in and retried the officers who beat up Rodney King on their job. So yes, there are exceptions. So double jeopardy is another defense you might want to be just aware of and understand that that's part of the due process. That's a procedural defense. Okay. All right. I hope this was useful and worth your time, and I will see you in class next.